I'm Lai Sun-Kin. I'm at Lai Sun-Kin Gallery in Boston. I am currently with four amazing human beings who will be actually giving you an artist talk. So we have Juan Omar Rodriguez, who's the curator. He curated the exhibition that's currently at the gallery, Communal Medicine Tending Abundance. And then we have Rixy, we have Gina Goico, and Perla Mabel. So I don't want to take too much of everyone's time because one of us is going to moderate the talk. So take it away.
Okay, thank you. So yes, the show is called Communal Medicine Tending Abundance. And the kind of thread line throughout the works in the show is this idea of abundance, both as a kind of aesthetic strategy and then also a political commitment. As you can, if you take a look around some of the works, you'll see a lot of an abundance of color and texture, but also thinking about like embodying or the abundance of flesh. There's a lot of figurative work here, thinking about sensuality too, and touch, and just being comfortable in your own body. But then, thinking about abundance as political, commitment, and thinking about the political dimension of excess and having plenty. Also thinking about the kind of realities that we live in, which are defined by capitalism, which provides kind of a scarcity of resources, or this idea of competing for different things that really shouldn't be commodities, but also thinking about colonialism and racism and patriarchy and the way that humanity is so scaffolded, where there's one idea of what is normative and normal, and then everyone else is just like less than or a little bit of. So abundance as like both a redistribution of like comfort, pleasure, joy through very material means, but then also conceptually in terms of like, we don't have to think about defining human. Everything else is very, worth being respected and valued. And this also gets into this idea of like interconnectedness. When we are thinking about horizontal relationships and value systems, like even though there's a lot of figurative work in this show, it's also thinking about our connections with other realms and other beings. So with that kind of preamble, one of the questions that I have is, thinking about abundance as an aesthetic and political kind of category or approach, how does it look like in your practice? And who wants to take this first? Oh, okay. Nothing?
Okay.
Just touching the side.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Perla Mabel. And basically, when I think about abundance in my work, it's really about the layers within our identities that has really shifted the conversation for me, because I want to celebrate all of those layers and I want to examine them and bring them into light because they contribute to one another. And thinking about like this etherealness, right? Spirituality and our connection to our ancestors. I want to celebrate that, and I do that through materiality. I do it through subject matter, but I also do it in the process. So the abundance for me is really in the process, right? And it's about how can I layer this process to give to myself, but also to others in the way that it ends and kind of inhabits the space. So I use a lot of mediums like oil paints and beads and fabric that normally don't go together, but because you would think that what makes me who I am doesn't normally go together is why I do it. And it's like that combination of symbolism, right? And celebrating that.
Okay, so you're passing it directly to me.
See.
Okay. I love that. I think that there's a lot of that idea of abundance that I can relate to, especially because we tend to believe in abundance with something that's material and something that's really like connected to earth. And I think that when I think about abundance too, it's beyond, like, it is, no, you know what? It's part of human connection. It's part of, love with like capital L and not the romanticized part. Just like how we tend to each other, how we are making sure that we are involving our communities, and our communities sometimes is also our ancestors, our spiritual practices, but also where we are at, like location, our earth, how do we relate to it? So for me, I think with abundance, this capitalist system has made us think that it is this material and tactile experience of accumulation in which other people will have less of something in order for you to get. But I think that abundance is just like a way of being, that it's part of how we should like go back into and connect, right? Like connect to being held, being joyful, being like receiving pleasure in ways that are not tending to capitalism, and it's more about the connections. So exacto. And I'm not, I mean, that is a lot to put on my art. I'm sorry art pieces that I'm putting all of that into you. But this is what I'm thinking when I'm doing these things. And I'm thinking about literally embraces and you know, like the ephemeral too, whenever I do this type of collaborative work. Like there's abundance of experience, abundance of being, and someday we'll be able to experience that joy everywhere. Someday.
Ooh. I also like going last because then I could hear what y'all said. So, ditto. Honestly though, but like I really feel for what y'all are saying in terms of abundance. One thing that I think I've been hearing more and more, like the words that are coming out is like the medicine part and the abundance part. And when I think about what medicine is doing, it's because there's an accidental or maybe unintentional wound or cut that's kind of been made, and most of the times it's unintentional, and most of the times it's not from our own doing, or if it is, you know, oops. But the abundance part, I think, really helps like heal a lot of those wounds. And in order for me to like, if we're looking at all these political stances, the earthly stances, things out of our control that I can't really say, like, again, I made intentional wounds or whatever the case, but the abundance is like how I can heal it. The abundance is how I can put some sparkles on it and say, you know what, it's not an ugly scar anymore, you know? And I think a lot of ways with my practice or in my process, I really appreciate being very like honest about that wound and saying like, hey, this isn't a wound that I'm trying to cover up or hide from, but this is a wound that like needs the abundance. Like the fact that the abundance isn't based on materiality, it isn't based on ego, it isn't based on pride, is saying the abundance is something that we actually need in our lives to be able to feel all of that, you know? And it's not something that is based off of this selfish matter, but for other people, for a community. If I don't feel great, how can I help share your greatness, and how can I share greatness with other folks? So I think a lot of times in the process or in my practice, the things I'm using oftentimes are recycled or sustainable, accessible materials. It's things that are around me based off of, not out of a mindset of lack, but of what is available. And I am going to create abundance out of that unintentional hole that was given because I'm broke, or that unintentional hole because I'm this or that or this. And it's just like I'm still going to find the abundance in that regardless, and know that being able to put it together and being able to like be honest about what I'm going through and why it's here, you know, putting it in our work. That same thing where I'm like, hey, I ripped it up, I was mad, I was going through this, and then I put some glitter on top. And, you know, it's still a bruise, but I'm okay, and it's still a pretty bruise or something like that. So I think there's a lot about what abundance is doing to like heal, and our process is very like hard. We're not, you know, always going to be on top of what we're doing, but it's like that's fine, it still looks great. So abundance in a lot of ways I think like really just goes against the politicalness of always looking at a mindset of lack, when it's just like I do have that here, and I can make it without paying for it, without doing that, because I already know that I need it, and I don't have to be, you know, greedy about that. So thank you.
Does anyone else want to respond more to that or add more?
I mean, I think it's interesting how abundance for all of us, obviously, in this conversation does look the same, like the connections that you're bringing up. So I do appreciate how it brings in the iridescence and like the tones of color. And I think it's interesting how we're all seeing abundance in that same way of like light and color and in that like kind of finishing product of it. So I didn't have a question, but it was just more so like I think I'm very appreciative of that. If there was a question though, I was gonna ask like what either tool or technique do you think has provided the most of that like euphoric feeling when you're in your process? That's always my favorite question as an artist, because we do so many different practices that helps us, but some of them are maybe more necessary than the other, maybe some are gruesome and we don't want to have to do, you know, so.
That's a great question, and I'm gonna like, it's funny because I feel always like what brings me more joy is painting, and it's the one that I do the less, like the least. And it's weird because I, for example, with doing the pellizas, which is that technique with, on that piece over there, the fabric knotting, which is like a traditional Dominican knotting, it's really like a meditation state. And I love it because it's just like I can be literally on the train and just doing it over and over again. But there's something about painting and just like the layering and putting of things and seeing how it's transforming throughout time, that's always like, I don't know, like it gives me like a little, I made that. Because with everything else, I feel, also with painting, how I approach painting, it's never really, like sometimes I sketch and then I go, but usually it's like, let's see what happens. But with, for example, my sculptural work and like things that are photographic, I do plan these things. Like I am, because they cost more money. There's like less, like I'm like, you know what, Gina, you're not gonna experiment that much. You need to know how much fabric you have and how long does it cost. Well, yeah, it costs also. Time is money, unfortunately. So yeah, so these are things that I need to plan and I need to like regulate myself because unfortunately, I'm not rich and I don't have unlimited resources, material resources for me to like explore that way. But with painting, people throw away painting materials all the time. So I'm really grateful for them because I pick them up and yeah, that's great.
100%. Like just piggybacking off of that, most of the stuff in my studio I have picked up off of the curb, okay? And if you look at my studio, you would think I didn't, but I'm very good at curating. But thinking about, I guess I'm thinking about like the medicinal part with your question or comment, Rixy. And the process for me that's like very medicinal is knowing that each step is going to lead me to the next step, you know, that it looks like this now, but it could completely change in 5 minutes, you know, and all it takes is either a color, a tone, like when it comes to painting, all I have to do is like add a different fabric on top or bend it a certain way, or it's either the glaze that I put on it that gives it like this effect that gives the etherealness, right? Or it leaves space to kind of ponder more on that moment, right? And I love hiding things in my work. That's how I give myself a little medicine. So I'm not gonna give them away because then it wouldn't be fun. But there's secrets in all of my paintings. If it's the way that something is like combined together, or you have to look closely because maybe I Sharpied something on it that's not really supposed to be there, or the scent of a lot of my work. I like to like throw incense on. I have oils that I specifically use in like my own spiritual practice that I combine in my work. And I like to kind of sanction the work before it leaves me, because that's like part of being an artist, right? You like put all of this work and labor and sentiment into these pieces, and then you have to release them into the public. And it's almost like this state of vulnerability, but also it's super empowering when you know that there's certain parts of those things that people will never understand.
So something else that I was thinking about in organizing the show and like thinking about your work, and like the reason I invited you to be in this show too, is like when I'm thinking about abundance, I'm thinking about excess, and in the context of aesthetics, like what does it mean to provide more than what you could process, or more than what's expected or needed? And so something else that I've been thinking about, and that can be kind of folded into this idea of abundance, is opacity. And this idea of like, even though a lot of you are responding to very specific experiences, all three of you are Dominican heritage, femme, so many other things as well. But thinking about that kind of pressure as artists of color who are women and also queer, or femme, non-binary, and women. This pressure to make work that is transparent and like contains cultural meaning. You're providing that in instances, but it's just like for yourself. And the viewer is meant to grapple with some of the meanings and really unpack why they're interpreting things in certain ways. Like I'm thinking of Gina, your photograph, where you have a collaborator of yours covered in this veil, but then that kind of gets into this idea of opacity and hiding a little bit more. But then you also add text and like a panel that also covers that veil, and so there's these layers of access. And then again, Perla, the way you're talking about coding things, and Rixy, you also get that too in the way that you're using materials, reusing kind of discarded objects sometimes, and recycling these materials, and like keeping some of the logos, for example, and text and whatnot in there to both provide like an entry level or an entryway into your work, but then still like push the flatness of the work to the fore. So like, this isn't a cultural document, this isn't a window, this is a fiction that I'm creating. And insisting on your art practice as something artistic and aesthetic that should be interpreted in those terms. So I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about, this is taking me to another question, which may be related or not, but another thing that's been coming up is this idea of medicine. And part of the title is communal medicine. And so this idea, again, of relying on a larger context, both other people, but then thinking about like the spiritual world, thinking about things that are more ephemeral or metaphysical, thinking about other sensory modalities that sometimes don't get invited into artistic spaces, like touch and smell. How does community or like these larger contexts come into your work? And how are you defining community as well?
Might as well. So in one of the ways that I think I've thought about community recently that kind of created this part of this collection is, I was kind of saying earlier how much is out of our control, and I found the best way for me to be able to offer some of that love and support was creating this like fantastical story world, like my world of Kukala, where the characters are all resembling of the folks around me, of my loved ones, of the women in my life or beside me as well, or other folks and their energies that I know in ways need, support, where we can like offer that communal medicine. And if I don't exactly know how to give it to these people directly, I'm like, okay, well, maybe I can have a conversation during my painting. I can have a conversation based off of this character's past and their history, and then, okay, that's like my cousin, let's do the next one. That's like my neighbor, the next one's like my auntie. So I think in a lot of ways I try to find the answers of that interaction with folks by resembling characters in a world where I'm like, okay, maybe by stepping away and like kind of when we like, I don't play Sims, but I know the people that do, and they go crazy with Sims. And in Sims, like the idea where it's like you can kind of see what's happening and in a lot of ways help influence or impact it. And granted, we obviously don't have that much power in reality, but if I know, okay, let me see if I can just play this demo world to see like what might be helpful, and let me put my mom in this, let me put my sis in this to see like, okay, like what was that conversation I was just having with them, or let me hear how can I support them, and still bring in the issues of the world and translate it so that, teenage Rixy understands it because she only understands cartoons, like pretty much. So I'm just like, put it in a cartoon episode and I'm gonna get the moral of the story, or in a Dr. Seuss book, like give me a rhyme and I'm gonna understand it better than having to deal with the reality as an adult, I'm just like, no. But in a lot of ways, it's like that's what's helped me really like gear and like really flesh out my kukala world, where it's like now that I've created it or found and it was able to explore this world, where I'm like, wow, like all these people that I love, that I can understand and like I can see them now, I can like build it more and bring some of that practices back. And when I'm thinking of aesthetics, again, a lot of time the aesthetics is nothing new to me. It's like, all right, she's wearing the same thing my friend was wearing, she's wearing the same thing I was wearing, like they look like my folks. Like a lot of times maybe this is just how I envision the energy of my folks as well, or the power and what they have gone through. So a lot of times it still doesn't feel surreal. It feels like just, maybe I have glasses on when I'm looking at my friend at this moment versus when I take my glasses off and I can't see them, So in thinking of how I can like practice medicine and community, it's just been very helpful and almost therapeutic to be able to like have an intimate conversation with characters that reflect things to like be able to deal with, I guess. Kind of answers.
Go first? No. Okay, my turn. I actually have a connection with the opacity and community. And I love how you were talking about Rixy, like, like this is your aesthetics. This is like what you see and how you're informed. And I feel that being Dominican, being read as femme and as a woman, there's a lot of expectations, and especially within the art world and in New York City, where like finally, like there's a lot of spaces where Dominican art is being circulated. There's a really, already there's this stereotype of what are the symbols that you're supposed to be consuming. By all means, we all love our plátano, we love our coffee, we got our altar over there, and that you will see all of these symbols and signifiers that are part of our culture. But, exacto. But this is something that, unfortunately, a lot of times it's like, if we are not tapping into these symbols that are highly circulated and hardly easy to access for those that are in the market, we are not read as Dominican artists. We are not doing it right. And this is something interesting that we have talked a lot in like Dominican artist circles and back in New York City, because it's a reductive way. And like that's what capitalism does, right? Like it's packaging all of us to make it accessible and consumable and reproducible for everyone to just like take a bite at it and just like print it on a t-shirt, sell it on Target, like something like that. Sorry. Going back. But the thing is that I notice, because I do like, I have Mami, which is a character that it's really like leaning into that stereotyping. But the practice that I am doing now with Loving Suits, that is for me like the most Dominican practice that I'm doing, because I am, and alongside with Belliza, where it's like traditional hand weaving, rescuing a tradition that is like heavily done by femme folks in El Campo, back in the Dominican Republic. This with Loving Suits, I am creating spaces where femme folks from the Dominican Republic are literally talking about their memories.
Yeah.
And they're elaborating literally on like making meaning together as a community. And, you know, like if you see it and you don't know that I'm a Dominican person, you're like, okay, cool. Like it's more like quote unquote universal and not like tapping me into the Dominicanness of it unless you know pellizas and you will see. But I love that, right? Like if you're like, you are Dominican that has been exposed to this type of weaving, you come in and you're going to be like, mi abuela does that shit. Like, I've seen this. Like, okay. And, you know, maybe, okay, you see the arms and it will smell like frankincense, whatever.
Yeah.
But then, like, if you have the audio pieces or you look at Loving Suits, you will see like all of these narratives of like, oh, my grandmother, I would visit her in the island during the summer months. Like I would like have breakfast, café con leche and pan, like these signifiers that it's another layer. Mm-hmm. So you have that opacity, and I kind of like that. Yeah. I'm not necessarily like, sure, like they are aesthetically pleasing, can be universal, but this is something that those like little temporary communities that I hold in performance spaces, that is what's golden. And that is something that it's not necessarily being sold and recirculated. This is like the healing space for us. Right. This is where we're making meaning. This is where like we're like sitting down and being like, damn, that is fucked up. Okay, how do we change that? How do we talk to mommy, to papi about like, you know, but also holding space for understanding their trauma. So it's like, yeah, you know what? I like this.
Piggyback. You make a really great point about when you were talking about how the symbolism is so easily consumed, and how at one point people end up leaning into like, let me reduce, or that reductive nature of bringing it down to symbolism. And oftentimes, I don't know for every folks, but like I'm a first gen and I'm only half Dominican. And I still, with everything I've gone through, haven't been able to actually experience my cultures in a lot of ways. So in my experience, to be reduced to say, well, if your work isn't Dominican enough, if it isn't femme enough, to say that your experiences still aren't honoring. So if you're honoring your practice, honoring culture and tradition, it's like, why does it need to literally put a Goya stamp on it to say that I'm, like, no. And so I think there's something I really appreciate with like doing it with community, where you said somebody may look at it and say, oh, my abuelita did that, versus like, oh, I can tell straight up, like she's just saying Dominican on her forehead. Or for folks to be able to consume it. I mean, which is fine too, like, listen, right, I got a flag in the car, come on. So, like, but honoring that versus, like, the need to, or race, or make us part of a box or a label of somebody else's understanding of Dominicanness, like, that's very interesting. So when you're talking about that opacity, or the ways that you're, like, resembling it in your work, you're using it as a part of your larger voice, and or our larger voices, and what you're talking about, versus that need to, like, kind of submit into another voice based off of that. And I was saying go off because, like, we've been seeing that a lot more. Like, the more and more the art world goes, they're like, you know what's working right now? Dominicans. And then let's just make them super Dominican as hell. And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I'm not Dominican as hell. Like, yeah, exactly. But of course, like, but it's just interesting, right? But it's just interesting to think about how, like, in our artwork, it's like, if they don't see these symbolisms, how quick folks are to, like, reduce that identity, to reduce our community, reduce saying whether it has any value because of their understanding how much it connects to something. So I don't know, that audience engagement or interaction, I think, is very interesting, where it's like, well, if we're doing our practice, how are they receiving it? Mm-hmm. Or what are they taking from it? Yeah. And then again, it's just like, we have booklets right there, and you still gonna act up, like, there's information or ways to be able to, like, inform yourself in our processes, or in all of the folks here. Like, even if we're all Dominican, we're not doing the same types of works, and we're not saying the same things, and I don't know. I thought that was just an interesting point that you were bringing up.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I'm gonna do a Rixy and say ditto. I'm just kidding. No, but that opacity is like super important, especially when it comes to like spirituality in my work. I think that my Dominicanness, you know, I've been able to come into terms with it because of my spirituality, especially my blackness. And so that part has been very healing for me. And that doesn't look like anything, right? Like everybody is different and there's so many different ways to be black. And because of that, it's like those layers, right, that we're talking about, and the materiality and the colors, but really it's about like how the journey is different for everyone. And what has brought me a lot of joy in my practice is discovering that with my subjects. Like my rhinoceros armor project, I am making a series of paintings and works of Black femme in Boston that I've interacted with and had the pleasure of knowing, but really because I want to venerate them, because that's what I do in my spiritual practice, is create these altars for folks to give them space to practice mindfulness, to sit with the materials and the objects and know that there's a space for them to be seen. And that's super important for me, because the reason I started to make art was because I didn't see the representation. Not only did I not see the representation, it was the misrepresentation that was killing me. Okay, like we can sit all day and talk about Gauguin, right? And many other artists, right, that have kind of jumped on this boat of let's make work that is representational, but I have no idea what I'm representing because I cannot identify with these experiences. so
most of our history.
Literally, which is why we need like the work to exist, and we need it to be diverse, because we need the younger generation to know that as you are is like perfect enough, and that journey of discovery is okay, because everyone should have the opportunity to do that. And a lot of people are not doing this because they're trying to survive. They're literally working all day, every day, and they don't draw. My mom, I started drawing because I noticed that she used to love drawing on napkins. And I was like, okay, well, clearly you have some talent you haven't tapped into. She told me she always wanted to be a nurse, but instead she had to work like custodial jobs for her whole life, right? So I'm like, there's so much beauty in that labor, right? And that's why I use all of these methods and processes, because of that labor. This labor got me here, you know, working 2 jobs, and I would go with her and vacuum at night. And just like those experiences have really like given me this meaning of beauty, which I've like fallen into with the fabric and the beads, which come from like Santeria and what we use to adorn our altars. And I just like, it doesn't always look like plátanos, right? I mean, I am a fan, we all know.
Plátano forever. Plátano team here.
Always and forever. But still, like that process of majando, right, of mashing plantains, right, that movement, being in the kitchen, those exchanges that you have with your family, those are the things that I bring in with me to the studio. Whether it's like, oh, this paint needs to be mixed more, or it's not the right kind of brown, it doesn't look like what I need it to look like, you know. And it's like that going back and thinking, what is this feeling that I'm trying to captivate? Oh, it's this perfect green, because that's the same green that my mother uses in the decorations in her bathroom, right? Yes. Or like using this drapery effect, because I don't know if y'all family do this, but every Dominican has a bathroom that looks like it's the entrance to a theater.
Yeah. it's a quinceañero, yeah.
Yeah, like you have stepped into holy matrimony.
Yeah. And even like the toilet seat has like a cover that's like pouch.
Gold ropes.
Yes. Yep, exactly. Yeah, so I just like wanted to take these aesthetics and show them like you have space in these galleries, you have space in these museums. This is art. Like just because it's not an oil painting of a stuck-up man next to a horse does not mean that it is not valuable or worth looking at, right? So I'm here for it.
I want to piggyback on that, and I think we talked a little bit about that because there's something. I'm sorry. I'm going to be that person that says like everyone is born a freaking artist.
Yes,
everyone.
100%.
And the thing is that we're told that the creative in our life is not productive. Hence, if it's not productive or marketable, it's not something to be engaged in. It's not useful. And what you were saying about the bathrooms, like, hell yeah, like people are so creative and people make art all the time, but we keep like beating down on those artistic practices because they're not, you know, profitable, they're not what it looks like, what art history has recorded as important, because there has been so many practices for years. Even that, like spiritual practices, like ritual is such an artistic and creative thing. How do you create an altar? What are you putting in conversations in that altar? What are you manifesting? I don't even how you order in a colmado through WhatsApp, yo. Like there's art in everything.
It comes so fast.
And exactly. So it's something that I just wanted to like highlight that. And I appreciate that, like also here seeing different voices, different practices that have like a ¿cómo se dice? Like a connecting thread, right? And you were really great in putting it together in conversation. So I appreciate that because, exacto, if you think like a Dominican show, look at this shit, girl, like this is a Dominican show, like, and look, like how we're like tapping into other things because we're not only Dominican, we are multifaceted folks that have different practices and are tapping into different conversations. So I just wanted to like, yeah, say that.
And also thinking about, you know, when I was starting to organize this show, like, it wasn't supposed to be, you know, a Dominican show or a Caribbean show or a Latinx show. But I thought, like, oh, this is interesting. Let's talk about it a little bit. You know, it was just like, I had worked with Perla before twice and with Rixy once. One time in the same show with Rixy and Perla. So, you know, I felt really great working with them again. I'm just like, yes, please. And I was like, okay, who do I want to bring into conversation with Perla and Rixy, who's like work I really know and, you know, who have all these kind of dimensions to their art, and just like thinking about opacity, thinking about abundance, thinking about glamour was the theme of the last show that we worked on, and also the vernacular. So thinking almost about, you know, the Chicano rascuache of, you know, collecting from the everyday and transforming, you know, making something new. So I was like, okay, let's think about other people who are doing similar practice. I'm like, oh, Gina. I became familiar with Gina's work through a project that she was in at the Latinx Project in New York. I think it was called Cyber Healing was the exhibition. So I was like, oh, okay, this is like this idea of healing, medicine. That's also something that, you know, I've talked about with Perla before and with Rixy. I'm like, let's do that. And, you know, thinking again about medicine too, like I come from a science background. I was on the pre-med track for a while and then I exited. So I was also thinking a lot about the way that health and medicine is defined as this like very specific institutionalized thing that is based on a certain kind of care, which is a commodity. And so I was like, okay, you know, thinking about abundance and some of the thinkers that we've been thinking about. And when we had our first conversation together some months ago, and like, I was just like, okay, what are the thinkers and writers that you like to read and inform your work? We're going to talk about Bell Hooks. We're talking about Aurora Levins Morales, who kind of provided the language for the title of the show, this idea of tending to each other and community. And this idea of rootedness in community as like a way of cultivating resilience in a sense. So yeah, it just worked out really beautiful that these were the ideas that resonated among you all. And then it was just like, okay, well, because you all have Dominican heritage, like let us name that, because that's still something really important to do in contemporary art, in the context of Latinx art history. to think about the Caribbean also specifically, and then also to think about Blackness, and then also like in art history broadly and contemporary art history, like think about femme artists, and also think about queerness and all these other things. I'm like, okay, what does it mean to be in a group show with other people who like share all these kind of like experiences with you, but are creating work so differently? We've already kind of talked about that in a bit in a few of our responses, but I don't know if you have any other thoughts or meditations on the way that this show kind of worked out, and maybe thinking about some early conversations, like what was your experience of this process, I guess?
Oh, can I go?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's like passive.
It was super healing. Yes, I absolutely loved it. I think that it was something I was lacking, and I really didn't even understand how much I was lacking it, because so much has been me trying to fill that lack, right, in the art world. Like, oh, showing up, like I'll be there, and at least I know I'm there, and I can speak for myself, and hopefully that will transcend amongst my community. But like being in a space where it's like I don't gotta worry about that. I'm not the only one that's like holding all that weight on my shoulders, but instead I can actually lean on my fellow artists to like have that conversation with me and provide a lens that maybe I didn't think of or experienced, because we all have different experiences. And so for me, that was really special, especially working on the altar together, because altar practices are very important to me. It's something I've done my whole life, and bringing it into the art world was something super empowering in my life, because I was really claiming it. And especially because Santeria has this like, it's had to be held like in a secretive way because of protection, right? So to be in a space where we can actually like have conversations about it and bring it into spaces and share with others without, feeling scared or worried that we'll be judged or misunderstood, even though that does happen. It still is very like empowering to share that. So I feel very honored, and I think that this was something super special that doesn't get to happen a lot, especially creating the altar in the gallery that happened between exchanges, right? Between conversations. It wasn't, not that we didn't plan it, but it was organic. It was organic. It didn't have to be forced. We planned con el flow,
But we let it
We let the flow guide us.
Santo flow, that's how it is.
The flow is called
Exactly. So yeah, I just like feel very honored to be able to share space with everybody, and excited to see what's gonna happen next, because I really feel like this is just the beginning onto what we could do together, and the barriers that we can break, not only just in Boston but everywhere. Like, watch out, world.
I keep, whenever I touch it, it's like my turn. Okay. I like that. I think that's something that was really cool too. Thinking about a collaborative piece that it was made inside like a gallery for a specific show. That shit doesn't happen that often. That you have like all the artists like say like, you know what?
Yeah.
Let's do this piece. And sure, like we were like exchanging text. I wasn't present when it was actually here, but for example, I was like, I brought like a bag of things, like, yo, like look through my, like pick and choose. And I think that that was also like the setting tone. Again, like, and I'm gonna talk about your labor too, because selecting us as a group and then knowing that we would like vibe and be like, hey, and also of course license like for allowing us to like, this is the first time I've ever light a candle in a gallery without someone like screaming at me, so thank you. Because it is really important a part of the altar piece, right? Like it's not, this is really filled with intention and honor, and you need to put fire into that. We should like. We're a second.
that right after.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
So that is something that I feel it was embodied here. Even also that like with blackness and of course like I am light skinned, but you know, it is so important to see through, because for me blackness comes up a lot through my spiritual practice as well, like with Las 21 Divisiones, and this is something that like going to Perla's house and right away it's like, hey, we know we're the same thing. It's really beautiful to hold it in different types of practices, right? Like Caribbean spirituality is black, and ain't nobody going to fight me on that. Like, sure, you have Catholicism, no.
It was a mask. We needed it.
We needed to cover ourselves. Exactly. Exactly. We made Catholicism like hip, yo. Like, I didn't know how, like, I thought you were supposed to be dancing and like doing stuff. You're not supposed to do that in Catholicism. Wow. But anywho, going back to this, thank you. And this is, I am so happy to be in conversation with y'all's work, and I hope this is like the first of many times that we continue, not only here in Boston, all around.
Absolutely. Yes. I think one of the things that I have been most appreciative, especially with doing vernacular glamour with you and continuing to get to work with you and meeting new folks as well, is like, as much as I love to think worldwide, universally, spiritually, and beyond, I just continue to think about Boston. And I think because this is where I'm from, this is where I was born. And I'm like, okay, I can go see other neighborhoods doing this. I could see communities, I could see other worlds that are still accessing all that safe space that, you know, we're still looking for and searching for all the time. So I think in a lot of ways I became so grateful. First off, I think vernacular glamour, I told people, I was like, I don't go out the house for shows anymore sometimes. And that show, it was like, I felt so comfortable. I felt beautiful. You said it earlier where it was like, being the only one in the room, sometimes like you'll be okay because you know you showed up. Yeah. But to know that you're sharing space with folks that are also saying it and you can lean on to each other, that's what vernacular glamour I think did for me, to where I didn't have to show up a little bit scared, a little bit, you know, maybe shamed, or, you know, kind of like, yeah, I kind of do this thing over here, and knowing that folks are probably already kind of condescending and having these like kind of entry points. And so I became very appreciative of how much that trust and that relationship bonded beyond just like, hey, maybe we could make some dollars off of this, or maybe it'll look good for the cover of a newsletter or something like this. And even then, still maybe put in a place where it's not a safe in general. You know, it's like we're going to try to put it, but we're going to just force ourselves into spaces that isn't comfortable. Again, thank you to Lyson, where it's like, okay, I know where my art will be feels comfy and safe. I know the folks that are there will make it feel comfy and safe, folks that invited us and the folks that it's sharing and living with. Yeah. And that doesn't happen often. You know, I think a big part of my practice more and more has become so locally and socially engaged. Like, you know, of course, my reach has gone beyond that for a long time. And once COVID hit and I realized, damn, like I can't be looking past Roxbury. I can't be looking past my own neighborhood because we're still not getting it. You know, like we're still not getting what we need, and the art and all this works. Like the art's not enough, but like, hey, at least can we get some pretty, like, some nice art to make folks feel better, something that helps them heal while they're going through literally the trauma that Boston itself is creating and, like, eating at them for. So I've just become very, I think, more as a person, just so, like, appreciative of how comfortable I can be, because if this is here, you have a part of me. It's not like, I have to know that she's okay, you know? Like, when I go to a show, I go up to her, I'm like, all right, you look fine. You look okay, like, nobody's hurting you, like, that's great. And I don't want to always think like that either. So to have, like, to be able to build that healing in myself, to know, like, there are spaces that are constantly still doing what they can to say, hey, like, we see you and we want to make sure you're okay as well. So I do appreciate, and I'm, like, more excited to what else can happen, because it's like, okay, we did this. And I know there's more too, or I know that we could build more, and it doesn't always have to be me doing it by myself or you by yourself. Exactly. You know, like where we can talk and say, wow, we are having the same conversations. we're having these conversations before you even put the show together, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
You just know how to say it really well. So, and that's like the reality of our lives, where it's like, this isn't just a random exhibition just to put together for First Friday in the fall. It's like, no, we've been doing this for a while. This is what we've been living or surviving through for a while. Let's put it together and give it, you know, some of that like compassion and understanding. So I do appreciate that a lot. Oh.
I think those were all my questions. The conversation has been really beautiful. I'm speechless. I don't know how to follow up on it. But I guess, you know, one of the questions earlier was about like your favorite tool, you know, in your art making. But me as a curator, and one of the reasons that I focus on contemporary specifically is like these conversations that we are able to have together. You know, thinking about the weight of art history and like the canons and the, you know, the way that certain narratives have been written out, I feel it's very important to work with artists while they're still making to help them give language and develop language, and then also work with what you've been saying to like translate it, not, you know, because of the kind of expectation that we have, the reality of, you know, marketability, scholarship, academia, and like having to cater to a specific audience. Like, I don't want y'all to have to like deal with that violence. And so that's where I come in. I'm like, okay, let me give you the words so that you can get the traction you need so you can continue to make the work that needs to be done. At the same time, you know, when I can with my colleagues, be like, no, that's not this. Let's use some other language here. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much again for your generosity and for making this work and for trusting me, and also Lysan for inviting me and us and welcoming us and working with us.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoy this process and listen to all of you. Yes. Thank you so much. Do you want to like all? Yeah, let's.
Yes.
And then what happens? Group that. Yeah.